On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster changed the lives of millions living near the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the scientists who responded to the crisis. These are some of their stories, intimate portraits of research, innovation, discovery. Welcome, I'm Jim McNamee, editor of Dispatches from the Gulf, a series of documentaries, short videos, and podcasts. In today's podcast, we're taking a look at oysters. Almost half of the oysters eaten in the United States come from the Gulf of Mexico. They're an important part of the local economy. A critical tool for this industry is the Auburn University Shellfish Laboratory. Scott Rikard tells us how and why his lab raises millions of oysters every year.
I manage the hatchery production of oysters. We produce oysters for a variety of purposes, for research and for oyster aquaculture and farms in the Gulf of Mexico. It starts in the hatchery. We produce larvae in the hatchery, and those larvae then come to these tanks here where they're set on real finely ground up oyster shell. So when an oyster spawns, one oyster can spawn millions of eggs. We can get anywhere from 100 million to about 1 billion eggs a spawn. And that's usually anywhere from 15 to 30 females that spawn that many eggs.
Oysters' impressive ability to spawn means they can repopulate an area quickly, so there's hope for the future of the Gulf's oysters. Scott tells us a little more about the life of an oyster.
Well, oysters begin their life cycle as a free-swimming larvae. The adult oysters spawn into the water column. The egg and sperm come together in the water column and quickly develop into a swimming larvae. That larvae is swimming in the water column for approximately 14 days to 20 days. And then it looks for a substrate to set on. It settles out of the water column and attaches to some hard substrate. And from there it starts growing as what you commonly think of as an oyster on a reef.
We joined Scott at his oyster rearing facility, where he shows us oysters of all ages, from nearly microscopic spat to palm-sized adults ready for spawning or shucking.
So these are about week-old oysters here. These were set last week, and they'll spend a few weeks here, and then we'll use them for research purposes, or a lot of this is going to go to oyster farms in the area. So these oysters here are a little bit older. They've gotten quite a bit bigger. You can actually start seeing individual oysters now. This is the point where they would either go to some of our field nursery systems or go to some commercial oyster nurseries where they'd be raised to larger sizes for oyster farms. These oysters are about 12 months old. We have a farm location out in the open water where we raise these oysters. And again, we're raising oysters for research, but we're also raising adult oysters that we can bring back into the hatchery and spawn for future generations of oysters.
While some of Scott's oysters go directly to the aquaculture farms or wild reefs that provide delicious oysters for the Gulf's famous oyster industry, many of them play a bigger role as crucial tools for better understanding threats to that industry, like the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill, which many people fear is still impacting the Gulf's oysters.
We've done a variety of research projects that focus on a whole variety of things. We've done some projects right after the oil spill where we put adult oysters out to look at potential effects of the oil spill on oysters. We produce larval oysters for various researchers to do work with some of the dispersants and the oil and how that affects larval oysters. In the aftermath of the oil spill, there were several things that caused oyster populations to decline. In Louisiana, you had oiling of some oyster beds. You had freshwater releases to try to push oil out of some of the estuaries. Those releases actually led to mortality of oysters because of too much fresh water. There are things we can do as scientists to help the ecosystem recover, but what we hope eventually is that it takes care of itself. From my perspective, I look at scientists as problem solvers. At Auburn, we work closely with industry. We work with the seafood community. We want to know the why and how of things. If a oyster farmer comes to us and says we have a particular problem with a predator or some other problem with rearing oysters in a system, we're there to answer those questions.
Today, thousands of scientists, oceanographers, chemists, engineers, biologists are all working together to develop newer and better ways to understand and ease the impact of oil spills. To learn more about their work, visit our webpage at dispatchesfromthegulf.com. Funding for this podcast was provided by a grant by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. And thanks for listening.